In the massive, often terrifying story of the 20th century, there are few people who cast a shadow as long or as dark as Joseph Stalin. I mean, think about it. This was a man who took over a country of wooden plows and left it with atomic bombs. He turned a struggling nation into a global superpower, but he did it with a human price tag that is, frankly, still hard to wrap your head around.
And that really brings us to the big question, right? How did this guy, a boy named Joseph Stalin from a poor village in Georgia, a kid who was physically scarred and came from a violent home, how did he climb all the way to the absolute top of the pyramid and become one of the most powerful and feared dictators in all of human history? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. You know, this quote right here, this is pretty much the key to his entire mindset. For Stalin, history wasn't some story. It was a brutal, do-or-die race for survival. And this incredibly ruthless, practical way of thinking, this belief that the ends justified any means, that would define every single move he ever made. We are about to follow his path, from a revolutionary outlaw all the way to supreme leader. So if you're into these deep historical explainers, a quick like and a subscribe would be amazing. It really helps us make more of these for you. All right, so to really get a grip on the dictator, you have to start with the boy. Let's dive into Chapter 1, the forging of the man who would eventually call himself Steel. His childhood in gory Georgia was just a crucible of hardship. His father was a violent alcoholic who beat him and his mother constantly. He barely survived smallpox, which left his face permanently scarred with pockmarks. Then a carriage accident mangled his left arm, leaving it shorter and stiff for the rest of his life. And you have to understand, these weren't just physical wounds, they became the psychological fuel for this deep-seated resentment and an absolute, all-consuming drive to dominate the world that had been so brutal to him.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. His very religious mother, who is just desperate for him to have a better life, she gets him into the Tiflis Theological Seminary. The plan was for him to become a priest, but instead of finding God, he found Karl Marx. He started secretly reading all these forbidden revolutionary books, and so the seminary, in a twist of irony, became the very place where his new, unshakable faith was born: communism.
Yeah, he never graduated. He dropped out and went totally underground. He took on an alias, Koba, who was this heroic Robin Hood-style bandit from a Georgian novel. And you see, unlike the other big-name revolutionaries like Lenin or Trotsky, who were writing theories from exile in London or Zurich, Koba was on the ground, getting his hands dirty. He became Lenin's go-to guy for the dirty work of revolution, organizing strikes, running protection rackets, and most famously, robbing banks to get money for the Bolsheviks. He was basically a gangster for the cause. He kept getting arrested and sent to Siberia, but he'd just escape and get right back to it.
Then, around 1912, he drops Koba and picks a new name, one that would stick with him forever: Stalin. It comes from the Russian word for steel. See, he wasn't just a man anymore. He was becoming an idea, this unbending, unbreakable force. He was literally creating his own persona, the Man of Steel.
So, after the 1917 revolution, Stalin was definitely a big deal in the Bolshevik Party, but he wasn't the star of the show. That was Trotsky. People often describe Stalin as a gray blur, just some unremarkable guy in the background. So let's get into our next chapter, how this so-called gray blur quietly and systematically took over everything.
And this right here, this is where his genius for power really shines. In 1922, he gets appointed general secretary. Now his rivals, they all thought it was a boring, dead-end desk job, just paperwork. But Stalin saw its true power. The general secretary controlled every party appointment, every promotion, every regional boss. He wasn't just shuffling papers, he was building a nationwide pyramid of people who owed their entire careers to him, and only him.
So when Lenin dies in 1924, the knives come out. Lenin himself had actually warned the party about Stalin in his final letters, calling him too rude and saying he should be removed. But Stalin just outplayed everybody. He cleverly tricked his main rival, Trotsky, by telling him the wrong date for Lenin's funeral. So Trotsky misses it, and who steps up to give the main speech? Stalin, positioning himself as Lenin's most loyal follower. And over the next 5 years, he uses that party machine he built to systematically isolate Trotsky, strip him of his jobs, kick him out of the party, and finally, banish him from the Soviet Union for good.
So you have to ask, how did the gray blur beat the brilliant star? Well, Trotsky was the flashy intellectual, the amazing speaker. Stalin was the master of the boring back rooms. And here's the key. Trotsky's big idea of a permanent world revolution sounded exhausting to a country that was completely wrecked by war. Stalin's idea, socialism in one country, was simple, it was patriotic, and people could get behind it. But more importantly, charisma doesn't run a government, bureaucracy does. While Trotsky was making speeches, Stalin was appointing the people who controlled everything. He knew that real power wasn't on the stage, it was in the filing cabinet.
Okay, so now he has total control. And with that absolute power, he launches this colossal, terrifying project to drag the Soviet Union, kicking and screaming, into the industrial age by sheer force. And he did not care about the human cost. This was his plan to bend an entire nation to his will. And the way he did this was through the 5-year plans. The logic was simple, and it was brutal. Step 1, set these insane, impossibly high goals for industrial growth. Step 2, pour every single resource into heavy industry, steel, coal, that kind of thing. Step 3, take all the private farmland and force all the peasants onto these huge state-run farms. This wasn't just about food. It was about destroying the independent farmer, the last real piece of private ownership. And step 4, use every tool you have, propaganda, the secret police, you name it, to make it all happen.
And, if you just look at the numbers, the results were pretty staggering. In just that first plan, from 28 to 32, the Soviet Union saw these incredible jumps in producing coal, oil, and electricity. On paper, it looked like a massive success. The country was industrializing faster than anyone had ever seen before.
But that success was built on this: an estimated 18 million human beings. That's the number of people arrested and sent through the Gulag, that huge network of brutal forced labor camps that provided the slave labor for all these massive industrial projects. Stalin's power basically rested on 3 main tools of terror. First, collectivization. When the peasants fought back against giving up their land, the state just took all their grain, and that created a man-made famine that killed millions, especially in Ukraine. Second, the Great Purge. This was a wave of pure paranoia where Stalin just eliminated anyone he thought was a threat. Old Bolsheviks, army officers, writers, even regular people. Hundreds of thousands were executed. And third, the Gulag system, the slave labor engine that powered his industrial dream.
So he's built his nation into an industrial fortress, using terror as the foundation. And now that fortress was about to face the ultimate test, the Second World War.
His journey through the war was just as pragmatic and cold-blooded as his policies at home. In 1939, he completely stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact with his biggest ideological enemy, Adolf Hitler. They even carved up Poland between them. Of course, Hitler eventually betrayed him and invaded in 1941. Stalin was apparently in shock for days, but he snapped out of it and rallied the country, not with talk of communism, but with good old-fashioned Russian patriotism. After the insane, bloody Battle of Stalingrad turned the tide, the Red Army started its long, brutal march all the way to Berlin. By the time the war was over, he wasn't just a winner. He was the master of all of Eastern Europe. And after testing an atomic bomb in 1949, he was the leader of one of the world's 2 superpowers.
So that leads us to the final, really difficult question. How do we even begin to make sense of this legacy? How do you balance the builder with the butcher? I mean, just look at this. This slide lays out the brutal contradiction of it all. On one side, you have these undeniable achievements. He modernized a feudal society, he led the country to victory over Nazism, and he made the Soviet Union a global superpower. But on the other side is a list of horrors that's just almost too big to comprehend. The millions murdered in purges and famines, the 18 million people who went through the Gulag, and the total destruction of basic human freedom.
After he had a stroke and died in 1953, even his own party couldn't keep up the act. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a famous secret speech where he just laid out Stalin's monstrous crimes. This whole de-Stalinization thing wasn't really about morals, though. It was about survival. The party leadership realized they couldn't live in a system of random terror where any of them could be shot tomorrow. They needed things to be stable, so by blaming it all on one man's cult of personality, they could hold on to power while ditching mass murder as a government policy. Which leaves us right back where we started. Can those 2 columns on the balance sheet ever be reconciled? Was he the necessary brutal modernizer who built the machine that defeated Hitler? Or was he just one of history's biggest mass murderers, whose so-called achievements are forever drowned in an ocean of blood? The final verdict on the Man of Steel is still one of history's most profound and most disturbing debates.
So, what do you think? Is it even possible to separate the achievements from the atrocities here? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And if you found this explainer valuable, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more.